want to just go back for a moment and remind people of your concept of the value gap, which you talked about in Democracy in Black.
Yeah, so the value gap is this, we talk about the achievement gap and the wealth gap and the empathy gap, right? But the value gap is something much more fundamental, that this society is organized along the belief, right, or in light of the belief that white people matter more than others. And to the extent that that belief animates our practices, right, our cultural practices, it shapes our social and political and economic arrangements. No matter what the inputs are, the outputs will be inequality. And so if you have a group of people who are valued more than others, it means that you have another group or other groups who are valued less. And when that happens, those people, right, oftentimes live a life of precariousness. They work harder for less. Schools aren't as readily available. Jobs aren't readily available. I mean, we can go down the line in terms of thinking about how that inequality manifests itself. And the value gap, Brother Sam, obtains, right, even as we progress on the racial front. So we're not the same country that we were in 1966 as we are in 2016, and nor are we the same country in 1966. Were we the same country as we were in 1946 and 1866, right? And with each kind of advance, whether it's articulating the freedom, the principles of freedom, liberty, and equality in the context of the American Revolution, the value gap reasserts itself by reconciling those principles with the institution of slavery. I was just reading, or Civil War, or the Civil Rights Movement, or even the election of Barack Obama. In each instance, there's an advance that is then arrested by a reassertion of the value gap. I was just reading a wonderful presidential address by Judith Sklar, the political theorist out of Harvard, and she talked about the uniqueness of the American context, that we were a modern constitutional state with slavery, which was actually unheard of, and that the reality of slavery, racial slavery, overdetermines what we mean by citizen. And America was not a democracy, she argued in that address. I think it was in 1991. She argues in that address, wasn't a democracy to the passage of the Civil War amendments. I would even extend it all the way to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights and 1965 Voting Rights Act, precisely because race arrested democratic possibility, right? Limited democratic rule. And so that reality, right, is at the heart of the value gap. And the value gap is not about loud racists. It's about how all of us live our lives.
All right, I want to just make that point clear too, that it's not the value gap does not manifest itself in the explicit words or the explicit dispositions of any individuals per se. It can. I mean, I guess there are people who come out and simply say, like, look, non-whites are inferior, but in the main, just to reiterate what you're saying, in the main, it manifests itself through our choices about, I want to live near a good school. I want to live in a good neighborhood. I want to make sure my kids are hanging out with the right people. And
exactly.
Invariably, that ends up segregating people in some way from black people and people of color if they are white. And
I use this analogy when I'm talking to people trying to explain racial habits and the value gap. I use this analogy, right? I'm not a climate change denier. I believe the world is getting warmer, right? And I think it's the way we're living our lives that's making it happen, right? That it's human induced. But if you look at how I live my life, you look at my car, you look at my house, you look at my light bulbs, right? You look at the way I live my life, you would think that I don't believe the world is warming at all. Right. I don't. So it's not about the people who are running around screaming, that the world is okay, that the melting of the polar caps, that doesn't matter. It's those people we want to read as the nutcases, right? Or if you disagree with them, and then we absolve ourselves, right, from contributing in any sort of way. But when you look at how we live our lives, you see that we're actually contributing to the warming of the planet. And that's the way racial habits work, right? It's one thing to talk about the racist bile of some of the Trump supporters and point to them and say, see, look at all of those bad people. It's another thing to kind of point to the choices we're making in our day-to-day lives that reproduce reproduce racial inequality, that give life to the value gap. So it's not just a bad group of people. That's too melodramatic. It's all of us. It's all of us.
And we could say that even in the context of like a policy like property taxes funding schools, where you start with people who necessarily on day one they were slaves in the United States, but day wherever we are, there's still going to be that gap, and we don't care. We set up the system in that way because ultimately. The people who get rewarded by that system are the people with power and who are share the same complexion of the people who have power, largely speaking. So, and when you say any advances that we make, institutions come in. So, I mean, that's clear to me. Let's say post-Reconstruction, you have Jim Crow laws come in. So that maintains the gap in some way. It's almost as if, like, my daughter was 7 years old on the day my son was born. They're going to be 7 years apart at all times.
Exactly.
And even if one grows a little taller, she'll come in and she'll just keep growing in that way. What are the other institutions? Like, for instance, I guess maybe as I say it becomes even more clear since 1965 when we had the Civil Rights Act. We see the diminishment of the Voting Rights Act. We see what other things do you perceive?
But let's just be very clear, right? I mean, so it's not just simply Jim Crow emerges in post-Reconstruction era, Brother Sam, but it's also convict leasing. I mean, cities like Birmingham were built on the backs of black labor conscripted by police, right? For vagrancy, I mean, ranges, so how convict labor, right, which has everything to do with how black communities were policed, right, rebuilt cities in the South in so many places, right? And then when you think about it as well, you think about, we talk about the Great Society, right? And you talk about the legislation that came out of that period that had everything to do with the grassroots mobilizing and organizing that happened in the context of the civil rights and the Black Power movements, right, and the Johnson administration and all. But the last piece of great legislation that came out in 1968, the Fair Housing, I think the Great Society is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, right? 12 years later, just 12 years later, Sam, is the Reagan Revolution. He's elected in 1980.
Right.
So 12 years. What can you do to undo, generations of discrimination? What can you do to undo that in 12 years? Absolutely. And we know by 1980 there's a wholesale attack, right, on the assumptions, right, and the laws that undergird, that supported an effort to address substantively, even in a limited way, inequality. So not only do we see it in what you've described, we see in public school education, we see it in the labor market. We had a dual labor market. There's a reason why African American unemployment is always twice that of white unemployment. It's not because black people are lazy. It has a structural history. There's a structural reality that produces that outcome. Think about the dual housing market. One of the interesting things about the Fair Housing Act of 1968 is that it wasn't implemented. There's a reason why residential segregation. This society is as segregated as it was in 1954, right? If not more so. Particularly when it comes to schools, right? There's a reason why African American wealth is what it is. White wealth is 13 times that of African American wealth, right? There's a reason why African American communities were devastated with the collapse of the housing market, because we had just most of our wealth was located in our homes, right? And even in that, we see the effects, the lingering effects of a dual housing market. But then we get the claims that black people aren't working hard enough, they're not saving, as if there's no history to this.
Right.
As if there's no context to this. And part of the reason why that's the case, whether it's coming out of the mouth of Rudy Giuliani or whether it's coming out of the mouth of a neighbor, right, is because there is this clinging illusion of innocence, right? There's this illusion of innocence, right, that is so necessary to protect our fellow citizens from looking the ugliness of who we are as a nation and who we've been as a nation squarely in.
Hello, you. I'm Sam Seder. Looking for smart progressive talk that is occasionally amusing? Well, subscribe to our YouTube feed. Subscribe to our podcast. Like us on Facebook. And just generally enjoy us.